Hi, everybody. You can all hear me fine, I guess. I wanted to just give you a little bit about my background, just so you know who I am. My name is Liz. That's my Twitter handle up there. I really love tweets. You can, by all means, quote me on Twitter. I'm an independent lean and agile consultant. I'm actually a little bit of an interloper at this conference because I'm not technical anymore. I used to be a developer. I code for fun still nowadays, but I don't code anymore. So this is not a technical talk. If you were hoping for a technical talk, probably one of the other rooms will be better. Louis said you would really like this talk, though, because apparently you like science and you like thinking models and stuff with evidence and stories behind them. So there will be a lot of stories in this talk. I was actually around in that little magical period at ThoughtWorks that Jessica Kerr talked about, that 2003-2006 part where Dan North was creating BDD, and I actually got quite heavily involved in that. I helped him write JBehave. You'll see a little bit of BDD templates come into this talk. I use them for all kinds of things, so I will be using them a little bit in this talk as well. This talk is about uncertainty. It's about leadership. What I'm hoping to give you in this talk are some ways of becoming really great leaders yourselves. So those of you who are already in a leadership position, team leads, managers, coaches, there will be some tools in here for you to become even better leaders. For those of you who are not yet leaders, I'm going to give you some tools and techniques for helping people in your organizations become even better, and for helping you to step up and to make great decisions in leadership positions as well. If that doesn't sound like your kind of talk, I am okay if you leave. I would prefer that you were in a talk that you want to be in. But that's what I'm going to give you. I wanted to ask a couple of quick questions just as I get started. Can you put your hands up if you're in academia? Who here is from the academia? Brilliant, okay. Can you put your hands up if you've heard of the Kanban framework? Who's heard of Kanban? 2 people. You're all going to have such an awesome, magical time with this talk. I think you'll really like it. Okay. So there's lots and lots of articles you can find everywhere about the things that make a great leader, and they always look at the qualities that a person has inside themselves. Here's one from Forbes, honesty, communication, confidence. All the things that you see people exhibit when you see leaders acting. By the way, for those of you who are new speakers, you might have noticed I am still shaking a bit. This goes away after about 10 minutes, but nervousness isn't on there. I think it probably should be. Attitude, creativity, intuition. These are the things that we have inside of ourselves. I think these are great qualities to have as a human being, as a developer, as anyone who's acting alongside other people. But you know what I think makes a great leader? Great followers, right? If you don't help people to fulfill their potential, and to step up as leaders themselves and to do great, brave, courageous things, I do not think you're a good leader. I think that good leaders are defined by the actions of the people who follow them and how they influence other people to behave. So some of the tools I'm going to give you, I hope that you will pass them on to other people too. All right. So leaders and followers. I've literally read this book in the last week. So this is a very new book for me. I'm very excited to have read it. So David Marquette, he worked on a submarine, and he took a submarine full of very unhappy sailors who didn't really want to be there. Some of them had tendered their resignation and asked for transfers, and it wasn't a great submarine. It was performing very badly. There were dangerous things happening. And he turned it around. And he did it by helping the people on the submarine become leaders themselves. So he changed that leader-follower model into leader-leader. It's a very short book. I highly recommend it. It's quite magical when you see how everybody behaves differently. The same sailors produced an award-winning submarine that worked really, really well, was able to make decisions quickly, and those decisions were very good. So without changing anything, except for the behavior of the people on board, they were able to turn this ship around. He talks about control and competence and clarity. I love this. It reminds me a lot, the idea of control, being in control, competence, having mastery, and clarity, having a purpose. It reminds me a lot of Dan Pink's Drive. If you haven't ever read anything about Dan Pink's Drive, there's an RSA Animate on YouTube. You can go find Dan Pink Drive on YouTube. There's also a TED Talk. They're both very good. He says that when you are in a creative industry, the things which motivate us aren't money. Money is great for motivating people. Extrinsic rewards are great for motivating people when it's a boring thing you're doing over and over again. But when you're doing creative knowledge work, we're motivated by autonomy, the ability to think and act for ourselves, mastery, the ability to become more skilled at the work we do, and purpose, that clarity of intent that leads us to be able to make the right decisions because we know what we're aiming for. Stephen Bungay also talks about this in his book, Art of Action. Stephen Bungay has another military background, but he also works in business. So he's been able to take some of the lessons from the military and how the military handle uncertainty and create that clarity of intent and bring them into business. When you're working in the military, they say leadership's found at every level of the Marine Corps. This is a direct quote from the Marine Corps' website. Every Marine is trained to act instinctively. That means they don't have to follow orders. They can lead, they can take initiatives themselves. And here's how they don't do it. This is from Stephen Bungay's Art of Action. And he describes a very, very typical pattern that human beings get into sometimes. And I wonder if you'll find this familiar. He says that when we have an intent that we want to try out, and we're in a leadership position, we often make plans based on that intent. And from the plans, people will carry out actions, and then some outcomes result from those actions. And those outcomes form the context for the next set of plans, right? But there's a problem. We don't know whether the actions that people carry out will be aligned with the plans. And we don't know that the outcomes that result from the actions will have the right effects. And when we do get the outcomes, we don't know what they are. So we don't know what the context is for our next set of plans. And when we are faced with this uncertainty, we don't like it. We are not good at dealing with uncertainty as human beings. I will talk more about that. I will give you some examples. So when we see uncertainty, we tend to react to it by trying to get certainty from things. And this results in us issuing instructions to people about what to do. This was what was happening on David Marquette's submarine. The leaders who had been there before him were telling the sailors what to do, and the sailors were like, all right then. And if it doesn't work, it's the leader's fault. It's not theirs. So they had no autonomy, but also no sense of purpose. When you see the effects and the effects gap, you put more controls in place to try and make sure that the outcomes are the right ones. And then, when you don't know what's happening, you ask for information. When I see a project run this way, all I see is leaders issuing instructions. If you're on an agile project, it's often in very detailed stories with the acceptance criteria already in place. Those are instructions. And then putting controls and constraints in place. And then asking for status reports about how that's going, how is that story going, how is that project going. And now everybody on the project is running around trying to follow all the instructions while staying within the controls and issuing it lots and lots of status reports instead of actually getting the work done. I've worked on some of these projects. For the first 7 years of my life, I worked mostly in waterfall, and nothing I did in those first 7 years actually got shipped. It wasn't very useful. So Stephen Bungay says the only thing you can do if you're in a leadership position is to clarify your intent. Tell people what you intend. And David Marquette actually recommends that followers, people who are subordinate, people who have to respond to that intent, they also reply back with their intent. So the captain of the submarine will say, I intend to submerge down to 400 meters, and the person in charge of the air will say, I intend to do this to sink the ship, so to make it go down. Right? So they respond with what they are going to intend to do. And with that, if there's feedback loops, and those feedback loops provide control, and you get this clarity. So Stephen Bungay likes this gentleman. This is Helmut von Moltke. And he is most famous for this phrase. It's in German. I'm not going to try to translate it exactly. You can read it on Wikipedia. But it translates into English. We often say, plans never survive first contact with the enemy. It doesn't matter what plans we make. When we actually try to do the work, we uncover the uncertainty. We make these discoveries. We don't like uncertainty. University College did a really great experiment. They put some snakes under rocks in this electronic game, and they got volunteers to play the game. The object of the game was to learn how the snake population behaves and which rocks they like to hide under. If you turn over a rock and it has no snakes under it, you're great. If you turn over a rock which has a snake underneath it, you get an electric shock. Okay, so you find a snake, you get a shock. I hope they were well paid for this. They varied the probability of having the snakes under the rocks. So some people had more snakes, some people had fewer, and they measured the stress levels that people suffered while they were playing the game. They found that the highest stress levels were from people who had 50% chance of snakes. Not the ones who had 20% and weren't getting shocked very much, they were quite happy. Not the ones who were getting 80%. And were getting shocked a lot because more of the rocks had snakes underneath. But the ones who didn't know whether they were going to get shocked or not. They had the highest stress. They were also best at solving the problem. They had the most incentive to do it. There have been multiple experiments that show that we as human beings do not like uncertainty. We would rather have a bad certain outcome than uncertainty. We would rather get shocked a lot than not know. When we don't have certainty, we tend to try and pretend we have it, or we try and find it. It sells very, very well. Scrum promises certainty, predictability. Scaled Agile framework sells routinely and predictably. This is what people are selling. You can't have it. And I hope by the end of this talk you will have a deep understanding of why you can't have it and what to do instead. The problem is that because we don't have certainty, when we start doing something, we often have very little information about it. When we pretend that we know what's going to happen, which we often do in our heads, this is called cognitive bias. We pretend that we know what's going to happen, we make big plans, and then we carry them out without looking back, without changing direction. We often end up making the discoveries quite late on, when we find all the information right at the end. I wonder if any of you have been on any projects where it's all fine, all fine, all fine, all fine. Oh. This is the point at which most commitments get made, when we start out. And a lot of those commitments aren't even promises to people. They aren't even deadlines, genuine deadlines we're aiming for. They are mental commitments. I now have a phrase that I use for a deadline that somebody has chosen. And nobody will die if you don't meet it. No projects will die. I call them sad lines because if you don't make it, somebody will be sad. So, Dave Snowden, who created the Cynefin framework, when he wrote about it in the Harvard Business Review in 2007, he said, there is an assumption in our industry that a certain level of predictability and order exists, and you can't have it. I will introduce the Cynefin framework to you in just a moment, but I wanted to show you a dynamic within it that you'll be familiar with already. Do you remember the very, very early camera phones? If you go onto Wikipedia and you have a look at them, you'll find that the phones are in landscape mode with the camera pointing towards the user because they thought people would make video calls with them. And it turned out that the internet was expensive, bandwidth was expensive then, and it wasn't what people used it for. But it was differentiating, so they sold a fair amount of phones. So Kyocera, Sharp, people like that were the people making them. Do you remember Nokia's phones? With the camera on the back, and they had a flash, and next to the camera, there's a little mirror that you can use to take a selfie, right? You remember those? So Nokia did what we call spoil the differentiator. They took something that they knew could be done, and they worked out how to do it a bit different, and they made it very, very popular. Put your hands up if you've got a camera on your phone. Keep your hands up if you've got two, one on the front and one on the back, right? They've become commoditized. They are so prevalent, so widely available now, that people can pretty much guarantee you've got a camera on your phone, which means that we can now produce things that build on the fact that everybody's got a camera. And you get things like Pokemon Go and virtual reality apps. Okay, so we have seen this dynamic. You can probably think of other ways that this dynamic has come in. Most technologies go through this cycle where you have something new, and then it becomes really standard, internet banking, and then you can build on it, and it goes round and round, and now we've got Apple Pay and Apple Watches, and you've seen this cycle happen. The reason I introduce it is because the borders in Cynefin are fuzzy. Things do move around. The dynamics are just important as the domains in Cynefin themselves. Let me introduce you to the Cynefin framework. This is the most magical thing I have come across in the last 10 years. I love this framework so much. It's changed the way that I live my life. The hardest thing about it is pronouncing it. It's a Welsh word. So do you know the name Kevin, like Kevin Costner? Say Kevin. Kevin. Say Kevin. Right? Put an in it. Say Cynefin. There you go. Okay, you've got the hardest bit down. That's good. It's got these 5 domains. They're not quadrants. This is not a matrix. There's one in the middle as well, which I'll talk about. The first domain that we look at, the first kind of situation that we look at, is an obvious situation. So this is one where either children can solve the problem, or if we do need expertise, it's still obvious. So I go to my landlady in the pub. I say, what do you do when the beer runs out? And she says, well, I change the barrel, obviously. Duh. These are duh problems. We can categorize the problem. We can say, oh, it's one of those. I recognize that. I've seen that before. So we can categorize it. As things become more and more complicated, they require more expertise. A watchmaker knows how to fix your watch. A car mechanic knows how to fix your car. They have expertise in those things. The outcome is still predictable. We know what a working watch looks like, what a working car looks like. When you have that expertise, you can analyze the problem and you can close that gap. The problem comes from down here. This is why we do not like uncertainty. We have certainty here. We have predictable outcomes. Over here on this side, we do not. Chaos is accident and emergency. It is your house burning down. It is people bleeding to death. It is transient, which means it resolves itself very quickly, and not necessarily in your favor. At the end of 2012, a company called Knight Capital Group released something to production on 8 of their 9 servers, and they forgot the 9th one. They used a flag which turned on some software on that 9th server that should not have been on. When they went into market on Monday morning, that 9th server started producing trades that were not sensible trades, and everybody started reacting to it. By the time they found that server and switched it off 45 minutes later, they had lost $440 million. And that company no longer exists. That is why we do not like chaos. In chaos, we have to act, and act quickly. And it is not safe to fail. If your house is burning down and you do not get out, you will die. This gives us a problem when we come to handle this 4th domain here, the complex domain. In complexity, we do have time. It isn't predictable, but we have time to try things out. In complexity, cause and effect are correlated in retrospect. They're correlated obviously here. You can see cause and effect. You can see cause and effect if you have expertise when it's complicated. You can't see cause and effect in chaos. Don't try, just get out. But in complexity, we can see with hindsight, in retrospect, what caused that. But we couldn't have predicted it. There was a company once called Ludicor, and they had a big online game called Game Never Ending. They wanted to get more people to play the game. So they set up a site where people could share screenshots of the game. And they wanted to get people to come look at the screenshots. They said, they will see how pretty the game is, they will see how engaged the players are, we'll get more players. So they set up these tools, and people shared their screenshots, but they also shared other pictures, landscapes, kittens. And when the dot-com crash happened, Ludicor were left with this half-finished game. They repurposed those tools, and that became Flickr, the photo-sharing site. We can see in retrospect how that happened, but we couldn't have predicted it. Again, Ludicor tried to get this game working, and this time they got the messaging tools behind the scenes working, so the admins of the game could message each other. And again, I think it was around the time of the financial crisis, they ran out of money, they had to do something. They repurposed those tools. That became Slack. And Stuart Butterfield, who is the founder of Flickr and Slack, he says, if you want to replicate my success, don't try to create a failed MMO. That's not how this works. We can see in hindsight how it happened. So in complexity, we have to do something called probe, which means to try something that is safe to fail. And I'll talk a little bit about what a good probe looks like, why it's a little bit different to experiment, but if you want to use the word experiment, that's okay. In the middle, we have disorder. Disorder is the domain where we do not know which of these dominates, so we behave according to our preferred domain. Put your hands up if you have ever been asked for an estimate in time or money for something you have never ever done before. Keep your hand up if you were silly like me and you gave one. Keep your hand up if that got treated as a promise, as a commitment. That's disorder. That is treating something that is complex, that is new, that you've never done before, for which there is going to be discovery, there is going to be emergence, as something that is predictable. It does happen the other way round. I have a blog post called Disorder, or How I Got a Black Eye, where I did not read the instructions for something that was not safe to fail. And I got hurt as a result. So it does happen, but it's way more often that we pretend we have predictability when we don't. Along the border between the obvious and the chaotic is complacency. When we forget about things, sometimes we tip into chaos. It's very hard to get back the other way. You normally have to throw some constraints around the problem or get out of it, exit chaos. Then you can try things out. Then you understand what causes it, and it becomes a predictable thing until you forget about it the next time. Okay. I use this scale. Excuse me a moment. I'm just going to get some water. I use this scale to help work out where we are on that Kanban diagram. So I ask, who in the world has ever done this before? So 5, nobody's ever done it before. It's brand new, it might not work at all. 4, somebody's done it, but not in our organization. We have no access to expertise. If you have no expert, you have to treat it as if it's complex. 3, someone in the org's done it. 2, someone in our team's done it, and 1, we all know how to do it. If you have a 5 or 4, it will be new. You have never done it before. You do not know what you're going to discover. I showed this to somebody at a government project, and he looked at it and he said, the 5s and 4s, that's where the risk is. I said, yes, this is where the discovery is, and you don't know what the risk is going to be. But now you know where it's going to be. These are going to be the places where we make discoveries. And he said, but that's where the value is. That's why we're doing what we're doing. I said, yes, every change effort, every software project, everything we do that is new, it's because we want to deliver something new, some new capability. We want to do things in a different way, for a different context. There's always something different that's driving what we're doing. That's the 5 and 4. He said, so if I'm faced with a lot of things I have to do to get something working, we should do those 5s and 4s first, early, while there's still time to react. I said, yes, absolutely. And he looked at it and he said, but the entire industry does it the other way round. I said, oh yeah, they do that. Because we like predictability. And one habit I see is that people will do the 1s, 2s, and 3s, the things over which they have understanding, hoping that the rest will fall out later. By then, we've made a lot of commitment, we've made a lot of investment, and it's expensive to change our minds. Start with the new things. A probe in software is a spike, a prototype. Try something out. When you understand it, then you've moved into the complicated domain, and then you can put tests around it, you can stabilize it. So here is how they fall roughly. This is just a guide, roughly on the Kanban diagram. The 5s and 4s are not like the other things. I wanted to talk a little bit about something that is very, very similar to Kanban. This is the first time I've talked about it in this talk, so you're all getting the new version. This is a Wardley map. And I think with Kanban in your head, you can probably now understand Wardley mapping a lot better. It's very similar. So what Simon Wardley does is he has a customer at the top, he puts customer visibility at the top, and he puts how new things are along this axis. And then he plots the systems that you're using in your organization. So this is for online photo manipulation, so this online photo company. And everything moves this way in a Wardley map. As people produce the camera on the phone and then it gets spoiled, so it becomes a product instead of something custom built that only one person has. And eventually it becomes a utility, so AWS is a utility now. We would never think of making our own servers anymore. It's just not worth the money. He also talks about the different personalities that are needed to get this stuff working. So up here where you have Genesis and custom-built stuff, he has pioneers, people who are going to bravely try things, go out there, do the exciting, hacky, spike stuff. But then you need settlers, people who will take those spikes, those prototypes, and make them into a stable product. Probably the pioneers haven't written very many tests. And we want to put them under test. We want to get it so it's in a maintainable state. We want to make it stable. We want to make it work for everybody. And then it's something that we can either use or sell, preferably sell when it's a product. Or we can get something from somebody else who's done it because it's not differentiating for us. As it becomes more and more common, so it becomes a utility. Down at this end, towards the commodity, we have big platforms, things like AWS. And you have enterprise architects. These are your town planners, people who are going to work out how to actually lay out all the things that are needed for your organization to work. So by thinking about the different personalities you need, maybe it might affect the kind of people you want to have on each of your teams. All right, so I talked a little bit about certainty and how we relate to uncertainty. There is a problem that we have when we come to decision making, and I've already shown you some of it. There's a thing called apophony. So we're probably familiar with the term epiphany. Epiphany is that sense of revelation. When you see a pattern and you understand it, you go, oh, I get it. I get that. And it makes you very happy. Apophony was originally coined as the effect that schizophrenics suffered when they see a pattern and they go, oh, I get it, and they're wrong. It's come into English as apophenia, our tendency to see patterns that do not exist. I want to give you now an experience of what apophenia feels like, a moment of epiphany. Are you ready? Are you excited? Okay, here we go. What's that? Can you see the elephant? Yeah? You can see the elephant. Okay, it's actually a lava flow on Mars. This is a lava flow from Mars. If you can't see the elephant, maybe you can see this one. This is Elephant Rock in Iceland. If you can't see that one, can you see this one? That's an actual elephant, it's not a trick. All right, does anyone know what kind of elephant this is? It's an African elephant, right? How about this one? What's this elephant? It is an Indian elephant. So the Indian elephant is a subspecies of the Asian elephant. So we have an African elephant and an Asian elephant. What about this one? Do you know what that is? It's not a baby. This is a full-grown bull. This is an African forest elephant. It is a different species to this one. Did you know that there were 2 African elephant species? They only found this out some few years ago. I grew up with 2 species, always 2 species when I was a child. And I only found out when I was looking for elephants that there were actually 3. They're very different. You can see they have very different shaped skulls. Their lines diverged around the time of the mammoth. They don't interbreed. African forest elephants tend to be smaller. They have straighter tusks, which makes them even more at risk of poaching. They have different numbers of toes on their feet. When you go and you talk to some of the conservationists about African forest elephants and African bush elephants, they don't know how many of each they have because they still count African elephant as if it's one species. And this is really sad because we can't protect the African forest elephants as efficiently when we don't know how many of them there are. The reason that we can't do that is because the conservationists, they made commitments, investments in processes that only count one elephant for the African elephants. they can't change. They have these commitments that we make, these patterns that we put in stone that are hard to change. This is what causes us trouble. There's an old story about some blind men who get hold of an elephant, and one of them touches the elephant and says, "Oh, I can feel a tree." And another gets a tusk and says, "It's a spear," and one gets a tail and says, "It's a snake." And they come to arguments and blows and fight about what it is they've got hold of, which sometimes reminds me of a lot of analysis meetings. So I want to share a couple of patterns with you that we use to uncover these things, these uncertainty, these discoveries that are waiting to be made. One is deliberate discovery. It's by Dan North, who is the same person that did BDD. And he says, first of all, there's 3 rules. You have to assume there's stuff you don't know, ignorance. You don't know everything. But what's more, you don't know what you don't know. Okay? So second order ignorance. You know it's going to be in the new stuff, so optimize for discovery. Try out the things you know least about first, in a way that's safe to fail. Chris Matz, who worked with us quite a lot in BDD, he was an analyst, now does a lot of project management and coaching himself. He came up with this thing called real options. And he's taken it from the options model in finance and brought it to the real world. And he says it's harder to evaluate options and think about the rules of options in the real world. But there are some rules which still apply. He says they have value. Having choices in uncertainty particularly has some value. At some point, you have to make a choice, or it will get made for you. Your options will expire. But this last one's magic. Never commit early unless you know why. Some of you have probably heard of the term the last responsible moment. It's related to that, but there's a magic you can do. You can pay to keep your options open. So I want to tell you a little story about that, just so you can think about commitments and how to avoid making those commitments in uncertainty, how to buy options for yourselves. The Brickell Key Award takes place at the big London Lean Kanban conference in the States run by David Anderson. And this one year, he wanted to give the award away to 2 people, and they have a short list of 6. So the people who are voting on the winners, they are very expensive, well-paid consultants all over the world. And he has to bring them together for the vote. They tried it on Skype, they tried it on Hangouts, did not work. They have to be in the same room together. But there's a problem. The only time they can reasonably get all the people in the room is Monday before the conference. The conference starts on Tuesday. The awards ceremony is Thursday. But the lead time for getting the trophies engraved with the winners' names is 4 weeks. So they made 6 trophies. And as they eliminated people, they broke the trophies one by one. Chris has a great book about this, Commitment. It is a graphic novel, very nice read, lots of pictures. I am in it. On page 76, I'm on page 76, So I ask people, when I go in to coach people, I look for where they're making commitments that are hard to change. Here are some typical ones: the yearly budgeting cycle, requirements, upfront analysis work. And I ask, how would you change these? So you could change to a quarterly budget. You fund each department per quarter. You could ask the regulators for feedback on what you're doing. You could do lightweight planning. You could make small, frequent changes and small releases. And this one is magic. That great engineering practices, that continuous deployment, that's what allows you to keep your options open in software development. In 2007, Bain did this. They did a poll around, I think it was 400 companies, and they asked, were you aligned with your purpose, or were you actually doing great engineering practices? And they found different respondents, and we can see where the bad place is, right? The bad place to be is down in the maintenance zone. You're not growing, and you're spending a little bit, you're actually losing market share. So these were people who, they're not spending much more, but they're losing market share to competitors. We know where the good place to be is. It's up here. IT-enabled growth, yay, lots and lots of market share, and reduced spending. But which one, which is a better route to get to that? It turns out that people who went for highly aligned with their market, so they're producing great products, what they think are great products, but they don't have great engineering practices. This is what we call the alignment trap. They were spending more on maintaining those products, and people didn't like them, and they were buggy and hard to change. And they're losing even more market share than if they had just not produced anything. Even just having well-oiled IT practices, even if you're not producing anything new, just getting things maintainable, doing it really, really well, costs less and your market share goes up. People like things that work. And being able to change direction can help you get things working. So this is about keeping your options open. Okay. So when we're dealing with complicated stuff, we can break things down. We have to try things out in Cynefin. So I wanted to show you what a great probe looks like. You need 5 things to make a great probe, an experiment. You need a way of knowing it's working, a way of knowing it's failing. Those are pretty obvious. You can't tell it's working or not. You need a way of dampening it. If it's not working, how will you stop it? But equally important, if it is working, how will you make sure it carries on working, works bigger, works more? You also need coherence. And coherence is a realistic reason for thinking that this is a good idea. Dave Snowden says, a sufficiency of evidence to progress. I'm a BDDer, so I really like examples. I go, well, can you give me an example where this probe works? If you have an example, that's enough. You have coherence. We do not know whether that example is going to work or not. There may be other examples of good things that might happen. So coherence is not the same as a test. You sometimes get the opposite of what you want in complexity, but that might be a bad thing. You might get the thing you want, but it's actually a bad thing. Perverse incentives, we get side effects a lot in complexity. So having multiple success scenarios, multiple ways something might succeed, stops us from getting hung up on one thing. This is the difference between coherence and a hypothesis. So here's an example. I like using BDD templates. Kate is a product owner. She doesn't know much about her role. She's new to it. I'm going to make her a guide, and she can read it, and then she will understand. That would be fantastic. But Kate is a human being. Human beings are complex. Maybe that won't be what happens. And we get this sad elephant in our heads. A lot of the time, we see it, we go, that won't work. Sad elephant. We make mental commitments, and then we don't try it. We would rather have a bad certain outcome where we don't even try the thing than face uncertainty. We see these failure scenarios all the time. When she reads my guide, maybe she just will feel helplessly lost, and that would be bad. So I'm not going to write the guide. I won't try. We do not have a way of avoiding failure completely. It is important to do things that are safe to fail. My partner who is here with me, we are currently doing a probe, an experiment at home called how small a flat, how small an apartment can we live in? It's not working. We can change the context. So Kate doesn't know what's going on, but she knows that we are interested in finding out from her. We can put some feedback loops in there. And then she lets us know that it doesn't work. So the difference between fail-safe and safe to fail. Fail-safe is, I finished it all up and it should work in production. And safe to fail is, we should find it out and then be able to roll it back. Do I have 1 minute to cover the last slide? 1 minute to cover the last slide. Okay. I want to show you this. I'm going to skip through all the rest. It has taken slightly longer to do this. If anybody wants to know about how to give feedback, I can do that, and you'll get it. All right, so the last little slide. I made this diagram just to show you. Cognitive Edge, which is Dave Snowden's company, they handle feedback in a really interesting way. They put out these surveys that say, tell us a story about your life. Tell us a story about your work. Imagine your best friend is going for a job. And then they ask people, is your story about? And they have these triads. This one says past, present, future. There's one which says control, indifference, vulnerability, etc. And people put a counter, and they measure where you are. And you can see how that's measured there. So you get these patterns build up. And from that, they create what's called a fitness landscape. So you can see down here, there are these little clusters of stories. Up here is our it's IT plus purpose plus clarity, really great place we want to be in. Down here, perhaps not so good. We've decided what better looks like. I'm just using this as an example. When you have a tight little cluster in a little valley that's mapped by all these different patterns, they have about 18 measures they can use in their surveys, it's very hard to move in a direction where there's no support. When you see no stories in a cluster, you can't move that way. This is what happens when you go into an organization and you go, please can you change? And people go, that won't work here. And they say no. Instead, he says, take the low energy way. Find out what it is that will help people change within the context that you're already in. Listen for stories. Listen for the stories that are better than other stories. When you have somebody who has got something working, it's more likely that other things will work like that too. So rather than fighting to get practices accepted, if people are fighting you, try something different. Try a different context. And when you do see things working, amplify them. Amplify those probes. Those are probes that people are already carrying out. Amplify those. Because that's how you get these things spreading. Catherine Kirk says, mastery is understanding how to work with the grain, not against it. I will finish with one thing. We are often very hard on ourselves when we fail. And it causes us to avoid that failure again and to not try things. When you find things are working for yourselves, give your little inner elephant, that sad elephant, a bit of a cheer and a bit of a hug. Congratulate yourself. Tell yourselves, well done. Amplify your own probes that are working, because we notice failure so much more than we notice success. Be looking out for success, looking out for those good things all the time. And you will be a great leader. Thank you very much. I do not know if we have time for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really a really nice and great talk. We don't have questions from the audience, but we prepared a couple of questions. So one of the questions is, why do some leaders end up as followers?
Why do some leaders end up as followers? So we are not always leaders in every context. It might be, for instance, I used to be a great leader in BDD. I was one of the early people. But when I move into a new role, like being a coach, then I have to learn from other people, and I have to be guided by other people because I've got a new role. Also, some people, when you don't like trying out new things, and people who are stressed don't like trying out new things, then often they end up just doing the same thing over and over and over again. Meanwhile, people are trying out new things, so they're overtaking them. Don't be one of the people who's afraid to try. Find ways to make it safe for yourselves. What was the second one?
Yeah, in your opinion, what would be the next revolution in leadership at IT companies?
What's the next revolution? I can tell you that in London, we've seen a lot of revolutions start in London in IT. In London, I asked whether people had heard of Kanban, and most hands in the room went up. I think that Kanban and Wardley mapping are starting to take over. They are now in the SAFe, even the SAFe literature has Cynefin in. They're in a lot of Agile decks. Simon Wardley's stuff is starting to be adopted at a strategy level for how you choose what to work on next. So I think Cynefin and Wardley mapping are probably going to be the next big revolution, and I've already seen it start happening and start making a very big difference in other organizations. So I'm going to be around for lunch as well, so please do come and ask me more about it. I have about 8 hours of material on Cynefin, and as you can see, it doesn't all fit into 1 hour talk. Thank you.